Across America, BP supports more than 275,000 jobs to keep energy flowing. Jobs like updating turbines at one of our Indiana wind farms and producing more oil and gas with fewer operational emissions in the Gulf of Mexico. It's and, not or. See what doing both means for energy nationwide at bp.com/investing in America.
The stress and crowds of holiday shopping can put a damper on your holiday spirit, and you don't always find all the perfect gifts you're looking for. The Virginia Lottery's games make easy and tremendously fun gifts for all the adults in your life, even you. Spruce up your gift-giving game this holiday season with the Virginia Lottery. The Virginia Lottery's holiday scratchers are a gift any adult will love. Treat yourself to some winter wonderment and play the lottery's holiday online instant games from anywhere in Virginia. Visit valottery.com/holiday. Please gift responsibly. Lottery games are not for minors.
Hey, it's Ryan Holiday, host of the Daily Stoic podcast. When I bought my first house in 2013, part of the way I paid for it was we would rent it out on Airbnb in Austin when there was South by Southwest or F1 or ACL. And then later, when that tiny little house became my office, I would work there, I'd do my writing during the week. Then on the weekends, we'd rent it out to people who were coming in from out of town on Airbnb. And you may be sitting on an Airbnb and not even know it. You've probably had the same experience. You stayed in an Airbnb and thought, this is doable. Maybe I could rent my place on Airbnb. And it's really that simple. You can start with a spare room or you can rent your whole place. Maybe you're traveling to see friends and family for the holidays. While you're away, your home could be an Airbnb. Your home might be worth more than you think. Find out at airbnb.com/host.
Content warning. This episode contains discussion of murders and domestic abuse.
Murder weapons come in all shapes and sizes. But throughout history, one of the most potent and feared killing methods has been poison. Tipping a toxin into a target's food or drink and watching them succumb. Poison has often been characterized as a so-called woman's weapon in popular culture.
We are always looking to interview authors of books on crime. Recently, we had the absolute pleasure of getting to talk to author and illustrator Lisa Perrin. Her new book, The League of Lady Poisoners, Illustrated True Stories of Dangerous Women, came out very recently. It features beautiful illustrations and chilling tales of all sorts of poisoners.
We love this book. It was chock full of mind-blowing stories we'd never heard of before. And that is saying something because we're nerds about both crime and history. We hope you enjoy our conversation with Lisa as much as we did. And check out her book. We'll include a link in our show notes. My name is Anya Kane. I'm a journalist.
And I'm Kevin Greenlee. I'm an attorney.
And this is The Murdersheet.
We're a true crime podcast focused on original reporting, interviews, and deep dives into murder cases. We're The Murdersheet.
And this is a conversation with League of Lady Poisoners author Lisa Perrin.
How did you decide to do a book on this topic? I know in the acknowledgments, you mentioned your friend Sarah sent you an article on the famous lady poisoner, Julia Tofana, but can you talk us through the inspiration for this?
Sure, and thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's everyone's first question. It's like, why? Why write a book about poison? Like, you seem like a nice lady. Like that's a choice. So like you said, I do mention at the acknowledgments at the end of the book that my best friend, who's also like my creative collaborator, actually sent me an article on a woman poisoner years ago and said, hey, you should do something with this. It's really up your alley. And that was because I have a bit of a flair for the macabre. I've always, like, my favorite illustrator is Edward Gorey. I grew up on like Tim Burton, and I just always had a flair for kind of creepy, but like interesting historical information and references. And I think like a lot of folks, I'm really into true crime as an adult. Like, I'm sure I'm talking to the right people, and your listeners will understand as well. Like, I think there's something about being human that we're just very fascinated by these stories, and we have to know more. And our lizard brains just, if they're good stories, I think at the end of the day, like the way they build, I think there's something about true crime stories that really resonate. So I think the topic, and it's not that I never thought about poison before or studied poison before. I think the topic just struck me as very interesting. And once I started looking into it, I thought, oh, I'm sure there's already a book about women and poison. I'm sure this has been done. And then I realized there wasn't, like not expressly on this, like there certainly been books about women criminals and women murderers. And there's certainly been books that have included poison, but there was never one expressly on that topic. And I thought, oh, I found something. I think maybe I should be the one to do this.
Absolutely.
So that's how I got there.
I loved how much your book gets into the nuances of history and all these different topics. And one area that I thought it did really well is kind of clarifying that we often think of poison as a sort of feminine crime, but in fact, it's actually much more equal opportunity than you'd think. And that while like serial poisoners tend to be women, poisoning just as an act is actually a little bit more diverse in terms of, gendered breakdown. And, I'm just curious if we could unpack that a bit. Why is this a society, in terms of your research, do you think that we kind of are obsessed with the idea of poisoning as like a feminine impulse or a feminine thing, when in fact it's a little bit more nuanced?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I think that was the question that became the impetus for the whole project. Like, why? Why do we associate women with poison at all? Where did that even come from? Is that even true? And I think the first thing I came across in my research, I was like, I'm going to write a book about women and poison. And the first thing I came across was like, oh, it's not real. Do I still have a concept? Do I still have a thesis? And then I thought, well, yes, because so many people believe this. And think this is true and think this is real. But actually, when you look at the statistics, and I actually made a list of talking points in case you asked, just so I can reference some of those numbers, because I wanted to make sure that I got it right. So a brilliant author, Deborah Blum, wrote this amazing article for Wired in 2013 called The Imperfect Myth of the Female Poisoner. And basically, according to the U.S. Department of Justice's report on homicide trends in the United States from 1980 to 2008, only about 40% of the murders by poison were female, and about 60% or more than 60% were male. So basically, in at least the United States, in that like 30-year period, it's not true that actually a significant proportion of that statistic are male poisoners. And then I looked back even further because I thought, well, a lot of my examples are historical, right? So we're talking about much earlier examples. And even then I found a book that had really wonderful statistics regarding that, and found also that it was much more even. It was a bit 50-50. So yeah, why did it become a stereotype though that women did this and men didn't, especially if men were poisoning just as much, if not more, than women? And basically the one thing I learned is men commit so much more murder than women just in general, that they're more likely to use every weapon, including poison, just more than women. Again, the statistic there is about like 90% of all homicides are committed by men. But yeah, so you're starting now with this, okay, we understand this isn't true. So why do we think this? And like I said, there's been a few examples in popular culture that I think have perpetuated this stereotype. I referenced it's mentioned in a Sherlock Holmes film from 1945 and an Agatha Christie novel. And then again, most recently in an episode of Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin, where they basically say deliberately, poison is a woman's weapon. And I think that cultural stereotype that we read in books or see in movies or on TV has perpetuated it. And I think it makes sense to our brains. I think we've decided that, oh, well, that makes sense. Poison's not physical. It's not like a wrestling competition that involves like any physical brute strength. So it might be easier for a woman to do. We also tend to associate women with witchcraft, the history of witchcraft, and with like wise women making tinctures in early communities. So there's this sort of there's more of a connection with women, I think, and sort of making those little tinctures or salves as what they would in their role as wise women or healers in their communities. And so I think, and I talk about this too, wise woman is just a jump right over to witch. So women in witchcraft, there's definitely a connection to that as well. And I think we tend to think of wicked women as being more conniving and more scheming and duplicitous, whereas like a man will just like stab you right to your face. There's no like underhanded scheming behind it. So I think we associate some of the traits of a supposed poisoner more with behavior that we see as traditionally feminine. So I think there's a number of factors that kind of lead us to those conclusions. And that's why the cases about the women poisoners, I think, get so famous, because they play into that fear and that imagination that we all have.
Yeah, that nice wife you have at home might be plotting to poison your soup.
Whoops.
We spend a lot of time thinking about true crime and reading about true crime. We have shelves full of books about it. Most of these cases that you wrote about were actually new to us. So I was curious, how did you go about finding them?
Yeah, that's a good question too. So I really wanted this book to be very diverse. I knew that I didn't just want it to represent one country or one segment of the population, because I thought that the themes, once I started finding some stories, the themes that I found were so universal that I thought that I wanted to make the book as diverse and global as I could. So I think part of it was finding stories outside of the Western canon, like looking to other countries outside of the United States and Europe. And I will say it was much harder. There's just so much less to find. So that research was particularly challenging. It was just something that was personally important to me. I didn't want to, also I'm an illustrator. I didn't want to draw 30 white women. I just thought it was not as interesting. I wanted to include more people, more types of people, and more stories. So I think just looking outside of that demographic helped me find stories that aren't covered or talked about as much. And yeah, the internet's an amazing place, but you can do today with, Google and a library card. Like, it was just amazing. And I think when I started putting this list together of who I wanted to cover, I had a list of more than 100 different women. Obviously, they didn't all make it into the book, but there's so many stories. Often there just wasn't enough information. But yeah, there's a lot out there. But thank you for recognizing that. I definitely wanted to when I Googled this on my own, when I started this project, I kept finding the same 5 women. It was like Locusta and Catherine de Medici and, just, gosh, what's her name? Why can't I think of it? Lucretia Borgia, the most famous one, who may not have actually poisoned anyone. And I kept seeing the same names over and over. And I was like, but there's so many more. There's so many more, and they never get highlighted the same way.
When you talk to songwriters, sometimes the first question you want to ask is what came first, the words or the music, because the listener experiences both at the same time and they're kind of intertwined. And as you mentioned, the illustrations are a big part of this book and a big part of what makes it so special. So I'm curious about your own creative process. I guess what came first, the pictures or the words?
Yeah, the chicken or the egg? It's another really good question. I also used to work in greeting cards, and people would always ask, what comes first? Do they write the cards or do they draw the pictures? And the answer is both at different times. Kind of, you start somewhere and then you add the other one later. So I will say, by trade, I am but a humble picture maker. I am an illustrator. That's my primary job. So I approached this initially as an art project. I did 3 or 4 portraits of women poisoners, just as a personal project. This was during the dark days of the pandemic, when I was very alone. I had a lot of time, and I was like, I will turn to my art. That will get me through this very dark period. And it was one of those rare moments where I had an idea and I had time, and that never happens. The motivation to do a creative project and then the time to do a creative project, they never line up. But for this particular project, they did. And so I drew these portraits, and I included a little hand-lettered caption with the story, and I was posting them on my Instagram. And I got a lot of reactions. People were so curious, and I realized this was an interesting topic. I wonder if there are more. So I will say, for me, I started with the pictures. And once I had the illustrations, I realized I had a book pitch. And so it started there. And then I had to work backwards, and I went, oh, I wish I had written some of it first before I proposed it, because I kind of had to work backwards from the pictures and kind of go back to the research and then write it all down. So for me, it was very much baptism by fire. This was the first book I've ever written. So I learned the hard way, where I would research something and then realize I hadn't done the research correctly and had to go back and reassess. For me, the pictures were the icing on the cake. I got to do them in the beginning, then I wrote it, and then I got to kind of come back in the end and finish all the images.
That makes sense. Yeah, those pictures are like beautiful, but also like beautifully creepy. Like I love oh, they're very well done.
Thank you. That's what I'm going for. My creepy cake.
Yeah. And here's one thing that I loved about it. I mean, we started the murder sheet by doing like these crazy spreadsheets of different types of crime. So we love categorization here. And I loved that you divided the League of Lady Poisoners into, 6 kind of categories: the professionals, the defiant, the greedy, the political, the angry, and the people who are lovesick, essentially. Yeah. And, I'm curious, like, how did you tease those different themes out? And then we'll talk about some of the specific poisoners, but how did you tease those themes out? And what sort of was standing out to you as you're kind of grouping everybody?
Yeah, I think initially when I proposed it, my plan was just to do it chronologically. That is what I had seen other similar books do. And I remember the editor came to me and she said, yeah, we could do that. But could we find a more interesting way to group these women? And I thought, oh, that's such a better idea. Like, that's one of those lovely moments of collaboration where I was like, that's so much more interesting than just putting them in chronological order. And so basically I was like, well, I noticed that there's little clusters like of themes that started to emerge. And then I kind of had to narrow it down. There was a chapter that didn't make it into the book called Victims, where I wanted to talk about women who'd been the victims of poisoning. So like there certainly were more categories that didn't make it in, but I definitely tried to focus on the big ones. I will say without any question, money was the biggest one. Like that could have been its own book. Like there were so many around that theme, and others I struggled a little bit more to see like, well, this kind of fits in here. I think I could make the case for a little defiance, or oh, she was in love with him, sort of, and tried my best to sort of group them that way. But it ended up being much more interesting to me because then you had stories sort of in connection with each other that were in different time periods, different countries, and you got to see those similar themes evolve and kind of see that it was bigger than the individual stories. It became a little bit more of a sociological study, I think, about human beings than I maybe realized or prepared for when I set out to just make a cool book about lady poisoners.
At the Murder Sheet, we spend so much time digging into crime stories that sometimes it's difficult to find the time to plan out and cook elaborate, nutritious meals. That's why we are so excited about our sponsor, Factor, America's #1 ready-to-eat meal delivery service. Our sponsors make this podcast possible. So if you go to factormeals.com/msheet and use our special code MSHEET, you're not just getting half off this high-quality meal plan, you're supporting us too.
So I'm obsessed with Factor. I had their creamed corn chicken and their tomato basil chicken risotto recently. Both were delicious. That risotto in particular was amazing. Plus, the whole process was a breeze. All I had to do was pop the meal into the microwave. The food was tasty and flavorful, which is no surprise given that each recipe is specifically crafted by chefs and approved by dietitians.
Having Factor during the hectic holiday season has been a boon, especially with us pumping out so many episodes. Head to factormeals.com/msheet and use code MSHEET to get 50% off. That's code MSHEET at factormeals.com/msheet to get 50% off.
Another thing that was really interesting is, we talked about how you did a lot of cases that we hadn't heard of, but even when you covered cases that people might be familiar with, you found different angles. Like with Lucretia Borgia and Catherine de Medici, you flagged some of the doubts that maybe they weren't even poisoners at all. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I think I was actually really disappointed. I thought those are my big ones, those are the headliners. When I asked people, do you know of any women poisoners to suggest for this book? Those were the 2 names that hands down came up the most. And so I went to the library and I got big biographies on both of them. There's really nothing, it comes up that that's part of the reputation, but it really became evident to me that it was all circumstantial. There was no real evidence to prove that these women ever poisoned anyone. And I thought, oh, do I take them out? And then I thought, no, it's still really important to talk about that reputation and then get to talk about who they really were. And for the record, they still may have participated in bad things or murderous activities. I'm certainly not going to absolve them of that. But did they actually poison anyone? And we either don't know, or it may have been most likely not, especially in Lucretia Borgia's case. There's just really no evidence that she did anything like that. And I read this really beautiful biography about her, and it was very much about how her reputation had been so tarnished over the centuries, and really just sort of labeling her as this wicked Borgia daughter. And there's a lot of legends, and there's really no proof that she did any of it. But the legend is so much more scintillating. It was like a little bit disappointing to be like, oh, she might have just tried really hard in her life. That might have just been her story. And that her father and brother were part of this, like, did maybe more duplicitous things, but that she was, either potentially like a hapless pawn or someone who was really just trying their best to be a good leader and a good mother in spite of the situation or the hand that she was dealt.
That one in particular felt like, we don't like her family, we don't like the Borgias, so she must be a poisoner, right? That follows.
Right. And then Lucretia Borgia became like a synonym for poisoner. Like when I would read all these articles from centuries later, they'd say she was the Connecticut's Lucretia Borgia, or she was, Florida's Lucretia Borgia, because that became the symbol of a woman poisoner that was just like culturally, socially acknowledged and accepted.
And then, the de Medici, the Catherine de Medici was just fascinating because it was more like, she did some really, like, St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, going after the Huguenots. That was awful. But it's not the same as like going around poisoning people. She was a little more overt in terms of pulling the strings there.
Right. She wasn't as duplicitous as we think. She might have had a little bit more.
Yeah, let's go shoot this guy, basically.
Yeah, we're going to shoot this guy is not the same as I'm going to carefully poison these gloves for my daughter's new mother-in-law. Right.
Absolutely. And then it was kind of interesting because that tied into female leaders, female rulers like Empress, I'm going to butcher her name, but I think it's Wu Zexin.
I'm not totally sure either, so I'm going to say yes.
Yes. They rise to power, and then there seems to be occasionally kind of a need to knock them down by, they got there by poisoning their way there.
Exactly. I think that sums it up really well. Like so many of the accounts I was reading was by chroniclers who hated these women rulers and took every opportunity they could to diminish their role or their authority or their leadership in some way. And poisoning was like an easy way to do that, was to say, oh, she's just poisoning the people she doesn't like. So that's how she got to power, and not because she was a capable leader or like made really powerful choices.
Of all these stories, I wonder which was the one that you were most like, why haven't I heard this one before?
There were definitely a few. I think the one that comes to mind first was the one of Sally Bassett, who was an enslaved woman in the Caribbean. I had not heard anything about her story, or knew that there was such a history that connected, enslaved people to poison at all. But her story, she's one of the few people who I think is sympathetic in the book and who you sort of root for, because I do want to be clear, most of these women are murderers, and it's hard to sympathize with them. But I thought her story of being enslaved and seeing her granddaughter enslaved and trying to use poison as a way to express her defiance at a system that had been so cruel to her was really powerful, and it had a huge impact on Bermuda and Bermudian culture. And that was one I knew absolutely nothing about, and was really eye-opening for me. So I definitely think that's one that comes to mind. And a few of the leaders where I don't think I knew much about the Chinese empress we just talked about either. I think a lot of the ones that were outside of the Western canon were also new to me, and that's why I thought they were so important to include.
Yeah, I was fascinated by the Sally Bassett story, and I really feel like what she did was justifiable homicide in that case. Like, that was you absolutely are rooting for her because of what slavery meant for these people, and what she'd gone through, and what she was seeing her children and grandchildren go through.
And so she's kind of a hero, which is complicated in this book about people who use poison and murder. It's interesting, and that's why originally that chapter was escape. She did, so I had to make it, escape and defiance. Like she was a reason where I was like, I think I need to stretch this one out because she belongs in the book, but is there a category for what I think she was trying to express? So yeah, I thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I think delineating them into categories and being like, okay, it's definitely different, killing a bunch of men for money versus, escaping an abusive system or an abusive marriage. Like we can be a bit more sympathetic towards some of these women than people who are just straight up, like, oh, I'd like to have some more cash, please.
Oh, totally. There's definitely just like, oh, they murdered for money or they murdered even for pleasure versus like, oh, this person was in an impossible situation. And this is what they thought of or saw as their only hope or recourse.
Speaking of women killing for money, and we're based in Indianapolis, so we would be very remiss if we did not mention the Indiana case in this book of Belle Guinness. And what can you tell us about her? This story is genuinely terrifying to me.
Yeah, I think if folks had to ask me, like, what's the worst one? This is up there, where it's just evil. You cannot empathize with her. You cannot reconcile any of her behavior in your own mind. I personally think that any story where they harm children of whom they are the guardian for is like there's like a special circle of hell, I think, for that particular action. But yeah, her story, she was a Norwegian immigrant and she was just really fixated on money from the beginning. Her first husband dies under very mysterious circumstances, but she very obviously murdered him and kind of got away with it. And then she marries and then uses money from that. And then that sets off a path that she uses money that she earns as part of a life insurance through his murder to buy this beautiful farm in Indiana. And it becomes this like murder mansion where she put out an ad in the paper saying, this wealthy widow sought to adjoin fortunes and was looking for a nice Norwegian man who missed the comforts of Norway and home. To make her acquaintance. And she was getting like 50 letters a day or something incredible. And she would tell these men to take their life savings out of the bank, sew it into their underwear, don't tell anyone where they're going, and come meet her at her farm. And then no one ever saw these men again. And it's just, she kept getting away with it. So she just kept doing it. And oh gosh, this one's just really devastating. And then basically when she fears she might be caught, there's this mysterious fire and her whole beautiful farmhouse burns down. And then the question becomes, did she die in the fire or not? Because they find these bodies in the basement of her children and one of a headless woman that they cannot determine for certain or not was Belle Guinness, because it just doesn't match her physical description at all, even without the head. So did she escape? Did she die in the fire? It became this great mystery. And then of course, after this, they dig up the hog lot and they find all of the bodies. And it's just the stuff of nightmares. Like I don't know if someone writing a horror film could dream of something so twisted.
I really think if someone wrote that fictionally, people would be like, that's a little bit
far-fetched. Yeah, like who's gonna, and I forgot to mention that she poisoned the men and then bludgeoned them as a way to again, just overkill, like Nightmare Town.
Yeah, that was, I remember there was an offhanded reference to her in some Indiana case book we were reading, and I looked her up thinking like, oh, it's going to be one of those like 1800s stories. And I was like, this is genuinely terrifying, this woman, and then the fact that I don't know, I think it sounds like she killed somebody and pretended like that was her to get away with it. And then it's like, what else? Where did she go from there potentially?
I mean, supposedly there were sightings of her for many years after, but they could never corroborate it. And the person who set the fire on his deathbed said he believed that she was escaped and free and very, very rich. And I don't know. I mean, nobody knows, but I wouldn't put it past her. She seemed like someone who could dream up something that maniacal, but just a heinous story. Like that was one of the ones where I would have to, I'd be researching and I'd have to stop and be like, I need to pause with this information and eat a snack or take a walk just because it's so heavy. Like that, there's certainly a sense of humor in the book, and I think that that's important, but it was very hard. Like, there were some where I was like, I can't make a joke about that. It's just too terrible.
Yeah, there's definitely a sense of humor in the book, but there's also like a deep understanding, I feel, of history and a sensitivity to, this is, about violence, and sometimes the women themselves are victims of violence who then lash out and do violence to others. So I thought there was a lot of it was a very entertaining read, but it was a very sensitive read, and I really appreciated that.
Well, thank you. I think that was the goal, was try. Yes, I want there to be funny moments, but I want to make sure I talk about serious things with respect. Yeah, that was definitely the voice I was hoping to achieve.
Yeah, and that's a hard path to walk.
That was a hard one. Yeah.
This is one story that I kind of loved, mostly because I'm a reporter, and it involved a crusading newspaper reporter who sort of helped expose the whole story. But Amy Archer Gilligan, aka Sister Amy, can you tell us a bit about that one?
Oh yeah, I appreciate that, that a plucky reporter saves the day. Yeah, that one is really fascinating, and that one appealed to me personally because if anyone knows the play or the movie Arsenic and Old Lace, that this story was the inspiration for that play, and then later the movie with Cary Grant. And I was in that play in high school, and I played one of the murderous old ladies, and I had forgotten, like, that memory was buried deep in here until I was working on the book, and I was like, Arsenic and Old Lace, why do I know that? Oh, was this setting the scene that I was gonna make this book later? But yes,
you come full circle from playing a poisoner to writing about the poisoners.
Hopefully not full circle, because that's being a poisoner.
Oh no, yeah.
Hopefully I'll stop in my semicircle. I have no desire to continue on. But I've got the book in front of me, and I just wanted to look at Amy while we talked about her. But basically, she could have been an entrepreneur, a great entrepreneur, in that she sort of was among the very first few people to conceive of this idea of elder care and having a home, specifically a place for elderly people to go and be cared for in their old age, because there really wasn't a system or an infrastructure for that. Typically, older folks just stayed with their families. But then with the Industrial Revolution, where people are moving to cities, they can't take their elderly relatives with them. So she was one of the first kind of pioneers in that, where she had this large home and brought in elderly people, and she was going to be this great caregiver for them. And she had this, the system was, I think you could pay weekly, or you could pay a certain down payment and you get care for life. And the care for life plan was just a much better deal. But then there was a big flaw with her payment system, which was that the only way to get more money coming in was to open up a new room. So she ended up having this unfortunate financial incentive to sort of have less residents. And poison was one of the ways that she did that. And a plucky reporter was the one who figured out that the reports of the deaths in her home was much higher than any similar institution in the whole state, and hers was much smaller. And then did the work to go to the pharmacies and find out she had purchased tons of arsenic. So basically, yeah, it was a thoughtful reporter who was paying attention who cracked this case wide open, and probably saved a lot of lives because it put a stop to her actions. And I believe she was originally sentenced to death, got a retrial, and then did spend the rest of her life in an institution for the mentally insane. But yeah, but she had this image that was very sort of grandmotherly and safe, and they called her Sister Amy, and she walked around with the Bible. So again, where you would never picture this person doing this awful thing. And unfortunately, because of these stereotypes about who murderers are, she didn't get caught for a long time. But yeah, just another mind-blowing story.
Absolutely. And yeah, I love the book really teases out that theme of it's, the sexism that women faced in these time periods, the kind of Victorian ideal of women are gentle mothers, homemakers, and, even that pervaded later on in later eras really helped a lot of these women cloak their crimes for a long time, because it would be well, I guess all these people just died of natural causes.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So it's an interesting comment about stereotypes, but unfortunately in this case, women are capable of everything, even murder. Yeah, even
bad things, breaking the glass.
Unfortunately, also even really bad things. Women are human beings. We experience the full spectrum of humanity and all of those, the good and bad that comes with that.
And one of the ones that just made me like, a lot of them, I was either sad reading about it, or I was like, wow, this is a crazy story. One that just, I don't know, maybe this is a weird reaction. The one that just made me cringe, like literally get secondhand embarrassment, was Christiana Edmonds.
Oh, poor Christiana.
I mean, gosh, unrequited love is no fun at all, but like, don't, like, I mean, this case, I for anyone who has watched the show Community, there's a scene where a bunch of the characters, Annie, Troy, and Abed, chloroform a janitor, and then they chloroform themselves to make it look like they're victims of it too. And
Yes.
This is basically a dark version of that, where this woman tries. Oh, tell us about it. I was
gonna say, I'd love to hear how you would recount it. But
it's horrifying, but very embarrassing.
Yeah, her story is also very sad. I do want to preface this one with that she did suffer from mental illness in a time that it was not well understood or well treated. But essentially, Christiana Edmonds, this is the Victorian era. It is so critical to be married and to be married well. And the idea of being a woman who was unmarried was very socially frowned upon. And she developed this deep, unrequited love interest in her local doctor, Dr. Beard, who already has a wife and 5 children. Christiana is well into her 40s by now, and she just becomes really, frankly, obsessed with him. And there's no evidence to believe that he encouraged this or that there was any relationship. It's most likely that she sort of created this in her mind. And she makes friends with his wife, and one day when he's out of town, she brings a box of chocolates and insists that Emily Beard eats one of these chocolates. She just has to have one. Emily Beard immediately spits it out. It tastes weird, something's wrong. She gets sick later, and she asks Christiana to leave. And basically the doctor comes to her later and says, we can't, we have to discontinue our friendship. I'm sorry. I'm convinced that you gave my wife poisoned chocolate. And at the risk of being found out, she insists, oh no, I ate that chocolate too, and I got sick too. It's not my fault. It's the chocolatier. He did something, something is wrong with the candy. I'm going to make sure to report this. So basically, to make this story true, that she did not deliberately poison her love interest's wife, she sets out on this terrible crusade to make more people sick by eating this particular brand of chocolate. And to do that, she purchases chocolate, injects it with strychnine, which, if I can tell you, is like maybe the worst of all of the poisons that I've studied in terms of what it does to the human body. Really terrible. And later she does arsenic, but initially it is strychnine. And then returns them. And at the time they say, oh, the candies are fine, and they threw them back into the container with the perfectly good candy, and then basically creates this reign of terror where like innocent strangers are purchasing candy, eating this candy, and getting very sick. And then when that fails to get her the attention that she wants, it escalates, and she starts sending these like poisoned gift boxes to several prominent figures around town, including Dr. and Mrs. Beard and herself. And eventually Dr. Beard goes to the police and says, I know who's doing this. I'm pretty sure it's this woman who has this crush on me. Yeah, and eventually she does go to court, and she is tried and again ends in a mental institution. But it was a complicated case because they didn't really know yet how to understand her mental illness. Yeah, that's another story that I just can't wrap my head around. Yeah, and there's so much more to it. I'm summarizing these really briefly, but
but you're summarizing them very well. And I mean, with her, it's like you can see how the sexism pervasive at the time is probably weighing on somebody with mental illness or some mental sensitivities, and making the whole situation worse. Whereas if she can feel, I'm a single woman and that's fine, and I'm like enough by myself, but she, all this pressure has been put on her, and she's essentially been told by society that as a quote unquote old maid, she's worthless. And so you can understand how that would be very painful, and therefore worse than whatever mental situation she had going on.
Absolutely. And even outside of that situation, it was just terrible to tell a person, a human being, that their entire value in society was determined by their marriage or their marital status.
Yes, and I thought it was interesting how many of the cases actually revolved around tension with that concept.
Yes. I think this is maybe tangentially related, but it made me appreciate so much that I am allowed to be single and that I would be allowed to get divorced if I needed it. I realized like divorce is very powerful and really good. I understand that it's complicated and it can cause a myriad of types of outcomes, but the fact that people who are not in a healthy relationship or not in a safe or loving relationship can safely leave each other is so critical and so important for the well-being of everyone in that community. So it made me appreciate a couple of things that I have access to today that I might not have had even a couple hundred years ago.
Really well said. I remember the chapter on Julia Tofana, just like basically she was almost like helping women who are being abused or who have a husband who's treating them very poorly to get out of that, because there's no other way. You can't just say, hey, I want a divorce. That's not a thing back then.
Not possible in patriarchal Catholic Renaissance Italy. And you realize like it's so important to have that mechanism, that lever to get out if it's bad. And it's better for both parties. So yeah, it made me appreciate divorce in a new light.
Have you heard? You can listen to your gripping investigations ad-free. Good news. With Amazon Music, you have access to the largest catalog of ad-free top podcasts included with your Prime membership. To start listening, download the Amazon Music app or visit amazon.com/truecrime ad-free. That's amazon.com/truecrime ad-free. And catch up on the latest episodes without the ads.
Hey listeners, this is Candace DeLong, the host of Killer Psyche. Imagine all your audio entertainment available in just one place. That's what the Audible app is all about. With Audible, you can always find the best of what you love or discover something new. Audible has an incredible selection of mystery and thriller titles and originals like Something Ain't Right by Roger and Zachary Stringer, The Space Within by Greg O'Connor and Josh Fagan, and Moriarty, an Audible original. Membership includes access to Audible originals, podcasts, and tons of audiobooks that you can download or stream as much as you want. And as an Audible member, you can choose one title per month from an ever-growing catalog of titles to keep. The Audible app makes it easy to listen anytime, anywhere, whether you're traveling, working out, doing chores, wherever your day takes you. New members can try Audible now for free for 30 days. Visit audible.com/DeLong or text DeLong to 500-500.
No, it's a great point, and it really does. I love that the book really gets into those societal issues and those, kind of feminism and patriarchy and how that intertwines. And one question I had with that is you've analyzed so much media, modern day authors writing about some of these crimes, but also, some of the original texts and original Roman historians, griping about Agrippina the Younger, or newspaper reporters who are fascinated because, oh my gosh, this pretty blonde lady's poisoning people.
Totally.
How do, a lot of these are written by men, obviously. And how does that, do you think, inform how we see some of these figures and how we see some of these female poisoners in general?
Oh, I think that's such an important point, and it really can't be overstated. I think I realized so much of the time, the story that we get is it's through the eyes or the lens of that chronicler, whatever that means in ancient Rome, or through that reporter and what they thought of it, right? And it's a little bit of a screenshot or, of exactly that time period and how they thought of women and women who committed crimes. And especially some of those from the Chicago in the 1920s, where they're like, if only she had been prettier, she would have gotten away with it, are just devastating. And but what does that tell you about how the system was working in that world, what they valued in that society, what they thought, what they expected? So it's all deeply influenced by some of those cultural components, but it's also just very biased, right? So you have to read it with a grain of salt and think some of this is true, but some of this is also very influenced by the time period.
We talked about some of the historical figures that we feel may have been wrongly accused of poisonings. There's not a lot of evidence there. And then we talked about Sally Bassett, who I strongly feel that was justifiable homicide. She was reacting to the abusive system of slavery. Were there any women in the book, or women that you were just looking at as far as your research, that you felt may have actually been wrongfully accused?
Ooh, I think the two big ones that come to mind are Lucretia Borgia, who again was never went to court or was never tried for any supposed crimes, but in the court of public opinion, not just in her own time period, but for centuries afterwards, was really vilified with no evidence. So definitely her reputation, and Catherine de Medici's as well, although she was certainly involved in some deeply unpleasant behaviors. I'm trying to think if there was anyone else who was wrongly accused. Maybe not wrongly accused, but sort of over accused, or not the consideration of mitigating circumstances. I think there were a number of cases where, yes, this woman did this thing, but did they consider, that she was in an abusive relationship, or that she had tried other things, or that, there were a number of factors that made her life untenable before she did this. So I definitely think there were a few where conclusions got jumped to a little bit quickly.
Yeah, I think the Angel Makers came to mind for me, where, they were targeting mostly abusive men, it seemed like, who were, alcoholics and beating their wives, and, in a small agrarian village. And they were one group where I was like, you could maybe see that.
Yes, and thank you for bringing that one up. I see that one as so akin to the story of Giulia Tofana. It's almost like the same story, just continued in another country a few centuries later, but it's the same story of abuse and having limited recourse and no way out. And for the most part, a lot of those crimes did not face the ultimate punishment, but mostly that was not because of sympathy or mitigating circumstances, but just because they were tried so much longer after the crimes were committed that they just didn't have enough evidence to hold up. But that one was a particularly painful one, where I was reading some of those accounts of the reporters in the room, and people were just jeering for these old peasant women who had suffered and been through a lot. People just thought they were backwards animals, and they were no better than animals, and they were monsters. And again, I am not condoning that they poisoned anyone. I think that is fundamentally wrong, but I think we can't look past the context. We can't ignore the story that some of these women testified about really horrible physical, mental, emotional abuse at the hands of those that they did end up poisoning. So what I will say is simply that it's more nuanced and complicated than the justice system gave it credit for.
Absolutely. And no sympathy, as you said, from the press at the time. And, when we look at it now, we might see it as, okay, well, maybe it was a kill or be killed situation for some of these women if a person is consistently physically abusive. But no, I thought that was handled with a lot of nuance and sensitivity. One thing that stood out, and you mentioned this in the book, but just like how much the Victorians were obsessed with poisons. What was that?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I kept coming back to it, and the phrase I kept reading was the Victorian age was the golden age of poisoning. And I was like, what a terrible thing to be golden. Yeah, and someone asked me that recently, like, why do you think that was? Was it because there were all of these new books with crime stories that were sort of fantastical? And that's a chicken or the egg thing. Were they mimicking that there were real horrible crimes happening and that was showing up in media, or vice versa? And there are some wonderful books about this topic. I think there's one by James Wharton that I reference in the book. But basically, the Victorian era was just awash in arsenic. Everything had arsenic in it. I don't think they realized how bad it was. I think that they saw that it made these beautiful, bright pigments and colors, and in like gray, drab Victorian London, I think that those colors were so cheerful and people wanted to like them and wanted to believe they were safe. They were using them in cosmetics. They were using them in tonics. They were using it in wallpaper and toys. And it was even on fruits and vegetables because they thought it made everything look better. And even when research came out, specifically about the wallpaper, I was reading a number of studies from doctors who were like, no, we can see that if people who are in these wallpapered rooms are experiencing these medical effects, people just dismissed it. Like it came out much earlier than anyone actually did anything about it in different countries within Europe and then eventually within America. And it still took a very long time for them to outlaw these arsenical pigments. People just really dismissed it. They didn't want to believe that arsenic was bad. And it was just so ubiquitous. So in the Victorian era, you could get arsenic at every grocery store, every druggist shop, in the form of like rat poison, because that was unknown. Everyone had that as a problem, and it was pennies. It was so cheap. And they actually, in the UK, had to pass a law in the 1850s preventing children from buying arsenic, which means that you know that there were a lot of children buying arsenic before that. And it was just totally unregulated. So I think the problem was just that there was so much poison everywhere, and it was such a part of daily life that it was just invariable that it would become used as a weapon. If it's in everyone's homes and they know that it kills rats, it could probably kill more than that. So yeah, I really think it was just the proclivity, just that there was so much poison around.
I loved your passage at one point. I forget which chapter it was, but you mentioned that, like, rooms that are wallpapered don't have flies. Isn't arsenic great? And it's, the flies are dead.
Yeah. No, literally, they were like, these rooms are so great. Notice there's no like bugs or flies in them. Like, yeah, because they're killing them, because it's harmful, right? A canary in the coal mine situation, no one paid attention to. And that's why they told everyone go to the seaside for the seaside air. But if they went to the seaside and the room was still wallpapered, they were probably still gonna feel sick.
Oh my God. Speaking of Victorian era and arsenic, one sort of kind of silent hero in the book a little bit is James Marsh, who's the chemist who basically came up with a way to test for arsenic. Can you speak more about him and about how his innovations ended up thwarting a lot of the poisoners?
Yes. So I think one of the reasons arsenic was such a prevalent poison for so long was because there was really no way to prove or detect it. And poisoners just got away with it because arsenic is largely odorless and tasteless. You can mix it very easily into food and drink, and its symptoms, especially if done in small amounts chronically over time, really mimicked ordinary diseases of the time. You couldn't really, even a doctor would be like, is this cholera or is this arsenic? It would probably say cholera in a time where everyone had cholera. So arsenic was just so prevalent because there wasn't this whole world of forensic toxicology that we have today, where basically we can test for things. I think they had old-fashioned tests for it, but they were crazy, like throw it into the fire, and if it smells like garlic, then it was like something that the person ate. And like, or what they would do is they would feed it to an animal, the thing that person ate, and then see if I know that's very sad. I love animals, but like that was the best test that they had. And a lot of this would not hold up in court. So basically, James Marsh, this is the 19th century, sees this happening. And he literally is on a case where he sees a criminal get away with murdering his grandfather with arsenic, because the only test they have at the time didn't hold up in court. And later that the suspect admits freely, haha, I did it, you silly fools, I'm free. And he says, I will solve this with science. I'm gonna prevent this from happening again. And essentially he develops what ends up being the gold standard test for arsenic, which was called the Marsh test, which was actually used until the 1970s, which definitively could prove very minute amounts of arsenic in the tissues of a body post-mortem. And then once it was so easy to prove, it became a deterrent, and people wouldn't be using arsenic the same way anymore, because it wasn't this get out of jail free, I'm not going to get caught, how are they going to prove it kind of situation. It was that cursed Marsh test.
Yeah, gosh. And it's so fascinating that it was used up until so recent a time that it really stood the test of time. One thing I was curious about is, just as you kind of compiled this and sort of did all this research, were there any things about lady poisoners that surprised you, or you kind of maybe came in with one conception and left, actually my mind has been changed by looking into this more?
Yeah, I think I came away from all of these stories with more empathy than I was expecting for a book about murderers. I think I had really resolved to get more of the backstory. I knew I didn't want to just do quick blurbs, like I wanted to go into a little bit more depth. And obviously it's impossible to know for sure why somebody did something and to know the entire context. You weren't there. But I definitely was surprised to see those same themes keep emerging, and they were often lack of agency, like a helplessness, because they were women in societies where they just had no recourse to get out of an abusive or dangerous or bad situation. I did not expect to be so soft-hearted about it. I think maybe I should have been a little bit harsher on some of the murderers, but I felt for some of their stories when I got more information. And even the most famous poisoners, finding out that they may not have poisoned anyone was like a huge shock. So again, I think it was a great example in like looking into stereotypes. Oh, we say poison is a woman's weapon. Is it really? Oh, maybe it's not. Oh, these famous poisoners, oh, maybe they didn't. Oh, maybe the ones who did, they had a lot more complex motives behind why they did what they did. And I'm not saying that's in all cases. There's the pure evilness of like a Bella Ganes or a Marianne Cotton who murdered for money and probably didn't give it a second thought. But there are certainly some where there's a lot more nuance to the story than I think they're often given credit for.
Yeah, and I think if we want to understand murder in general, it doesn't help to just say these people are monstrous and we can't understand them. It actually helps to say what motivated this, and you're always going to get people who are just purely, just being awful, basically. Like, the ones you mentioned, the money section is definitely filled with ladies where you're like, okay, this was definitely not, what were you thinking? Essentially, this is just evil. But with, a lot of the other ones, I think it's helpful because it really did feel like some of these came from more of a place of desperation.
Desperation is the right word. Well, thank you. I appreciate you did such a sensitive, thoughtful, close reading of it. I'm really impressed.
Do you have any crime influence projects coming up? I know you just completed this one, but is there anything that's kind of bubbling in your head right now about what might be next?
That's such a good question. I wish I was more prepared for it. I would love to work on another book project. I don't know what it is yet. If any of your listeners or fans is like, oh, I would love to see about blah, blah, like, please let me know. I don't think it'll be poison again. I think I'm poisoned out for one lifetime, but I love history and I'm fascinated by true crime. And I feel like there's definitely more facets that I'd love to explore and would love to illustrate. So I'm definitely going to keep my eyes open for what's next too.
I have to ask, like, when you were writing this and illustrating this, did part of you, like, when you went out to the restaurants or anything, were you ever like, I don't know?
Oh yeah, no, I something I said like in the introduction is like, it changed me. Like it made me not take for granted. Like, you go to a grocery store and you just trust that everything in there is safe, or you go to a restaurant, you don't think about it. And also I was like, after this, all my colleagues kept joking like, oh, can't invite Lisa to a dinner party, or, don't invite Lisa to lunch. And I was like, no, that's not what I wanted to happen. But yeah, I definitely realized that we just have a lot of implicit trust baked into a lot of these interactions that deal with food and drink in our society. And that's great. I don't want to undermine that, but I definitely thought about it a lot more and was definitely much more keenly aware of like when I'm at a restaurant and I leave my drink, like, oh, someone could do, like it's hopefully very unlikely, but it's not impossible. So it definitely made me aware of just general food safety and how easily like food poisoning can happen. I'm just much more keenly aware of all of that now.
And then I guess just last question, is there anything we didn't ask you about that you wanted to mention?
Ooh, no, I was really impressed with your questions. You did like a very close reading of the book. I had to be like, do I remember what I said about that? But I think you really hit on the major themes and what I was I feel like you really got what I was trying to say and what I was trying to do. So thank you for that.
Thanks again to Lisa for the great conversation. We really enjoyed speaking with her and reading her book.
We cannot recommend her book enough. Pick up your own copy of The League of Lady Poisoners, Illustrated True Stories of Dangerous Women. Thanks so much for listening to The Murder Sheet. If you have a tip concerning one of the cases we cover, please email us at murdersheet@gmail.com. If you have actionable information about an unsolved crime, please report it to the appropriate authorities.
If you're interested in joining our Patreon, that's available at www.patreon.com/murdersheet. If you want to tip us a bit of money for records requests, you can do so at www.buymeacoffee.com facebook.com/murdersheet. We very much appreciate any support.
Special thanks to Kevin Tyler Greenlee, who composed the music for the Murder Sheet, and who you can find on the web at kevintg.com.
If you're looking to talk with other listeners about a case we've covered, you can join the Murder Sheet discussion group on Facebook. We mostly focus our time on research and reporting, so we're not on social media much. We do try to check our email account, but we ask for patience as we often receive a lot of messages. Thanks again for listening.